comparative religions, sort of. The first of two topics has to do with at the social implications of the three major Western religions. Now, in all candor, I'm going to be looking at a very specific aspect of the Judaism that we experience, or that we experience from some members of the Jewish community in the 20th and the 21st century. But I want to use this term comparative religions because each of the three major religions can be perceived from their impact on society. And that being the case, if we look at each of the religions from the point of view of social justice, that is, what impact does the practice of that religion have on the society at large? I'm going to assume, and this definition can be argued up one side and down the other, that the best society is one that promotes the maximum development of the individual and provides all of its members with the necessities of life, like food, shelter, and clothing, with reasonable expectations of supporting that community by the people receiving that support, sharing the burdens of the society and equitably enjoying the fruits of that society. And the society is of necessity required to support and defend and protect the young, the old, and the weak. Now, from the perspective of Islam, Islam did not do badly by this criteria. It taxed minorities. For example, it taxed Jews and it taxed Christians where Islam was in the minority and had control of the government.
Yes, we did. Yes, very much so.
The minorities did not participate in the common defense, but many freedoms were enjoyed by the minorities, although Christians nor Jews were allowed to proselytize among the Muslims. So they had limited freedom of speech. But for example, both in terms of Muslim majority communities as well as Muslim minority, the Muslim world enjoyed a time of tremendous development at a time when Western Europe was in its dark ages, between, say, the 9th century and the 14th century of the Common Era. Its scriptures dwell heavily on the social and political responsibilities of the Ummah. The Ummah is the Islamic community, which kind of clearly reflects the life and times of the Prophet, because the Prophet, who was the mouthpiece of God according to Islamic theology and the primary source of Islamic thought and theology from an analytical point of view, all of the source material comes from the lifetime period of Muhammad, at least in theory. There's no doubt that there was some editorial adjustment made in the sayings of the Prophet during the first generation after his death. But the Muslims actually worked very hard to maintain a reliable line of their scripture. On the other hand, cultivation of a spiritual life or contemplative life would require some significant searching of the Islamic texts of the Quran. It is not true that Muhammad did not have a spiritual or contemplative life, but for reasons of managing the Ummah, a lot of the revelation has to do with the management of the community. The Sunni and the Shia have different ways of managing the community, and the Sufi, which is the contemplative or spiritualist expression of Islam, are not viewed as legitimate Muslims by a large percentage, precisely because you can either say they take great liberties with the interpretation of the Quran, or they simply don't observe the legal restrictions that are recognized by the Sunni and the Shia. So developing a contemplative or spiritual life in Islam would require a searching of the text. The texts are there because the Muhammad was not a crass or unthinking individual, but it takes some looking after. Liberal values, as we would describe them in the West, are definitely not part of the idea of social cohesion under Islam. So if I were to make criticism of Islam as a social movement, it would be it does not develop the individual as an entity in relationship with the divine. Now, the second one in line is Christianity, and it was born into the Roman culture, and largely due to the effect, and misspelled do, largely due to the impact of St. Paul. Christianity has a significantly individualistic aspect and generally passive with respect to society as a whole. St. Paul considered this life to have very little meaning, and in his lifetime probably expected what was predicted as the second coming of the Messiah. St. John has a very vicious understanding of society, and especially the Jewish society around him, and St. John is almost certainly reflecting a certain attitude towards a dominant Jewish society in which St. John was living, or the society in which that was being influenced by Jews, although they were in a Roman society. Jesus himself criticized the religious leaders of his time, but his execution by the Roman authorities was simply a travesty of justice and had very little to do either with Jesus' teachings or with the implementation of Roman justice. It was just a farce. My focus is, however, on a particular peculiarity of post-exilic Judaism. By post-exilic, I mean it's after the time when the Hebrews were in exile in Persia. And from the social perspective, I've mentioned to this group in the past that there are many streams of thought, particularly social thought, that are to be found in what Christians call the Old Testament and what Jews call the Tanakh. The Tanakh is a non-word standing for the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the additional writings. One of the streams of thought that comes out of the Tanakh is the permissibility and even praise of deception. It is always justified as accomplishing the holy goal or God's purposes. Does this mean that all Jews are deceptive? Not at all. What it does mean is that there is a religious justification that is incredibly easily abused for the pursuit of what are God's purposes and or my purposes.
What would be an example of that?
Got three coming. The first one, there are multiple in the Old Testament, by the way, but Rebekah takes Esau's clothing. Esau was a farmer. He lived off the land. He had sweaty clothes. He was a big, hairy guy. And Jacob was a somewhat smallish, lean kid. And Rebekah wanted Isaac to give the family blessing to Jacob, not to Esau. So Rebekah clothed Jacob in the hairy clothing of Esau and gave Jacob Isaac's favorite food, and quite purposely deceived her husband into believing that Jacob was his oldest son, Esau. So Jacob gave the family blessing to Jacob when it rightfully belonged to Esau. And that was, in terms of the Tanakh, fulfilling God's purposes. As I say, you can always clothe it in a just purpose. Esther and Purim are a second example where Esther does not reveal her Jewish or Hebrew origins as one of the concubines in the Persian court. And she basically approaches the king of Persia and insinuates herself into his good graces in order to establish safety for the Jews who, according to the legend, are under attack by Haman. The story is pure legend, but in the legend, Esther is perfectly justified in deceiving the king of Persia, and in terms of in seeking the execution of Haman. Purim is the holiday that is celebrated amongst Jews and is frankly celebrated with great enthusiasm. I have pictures of my son dressed up like a king for the celebration of Purim when Peggy and I and Steve lived in Israel. And it is celebrated. When Baruch Goldstein murdered 29 or 30 Arabs in the mosque in Hebron, he very specifically chose Purim as the day to commit his murders, because Purim is the day that the Israelites execute vengeance on their enemies. So Purim is a political holiday, not a religious holiday. There are many other examples of that I did not choose to plow through the Tanakh to find you, because I wanted to share the third one with you. As some of you may know, Jesus is a despicable character in the Talmud. He is considered the product of a harlot and a product of a Roman intercourse, and Mary is described as a harlot. And this is a legendary story, obviously, but I want to point out the ethics and morality that are exemplified in the legend. A certain rabbi is reported to have approached Mary because there was a discussion among rabbis as to Jesus' origins. And one tradition said that Jesus was the product of intercourse while Mary was menstruating, and another legend was that that Jesus was the product of infidelity, that he was not the product of Joseph, Mary's husband, but the product of someone who had seduced Mary alternatively. So there are two legends, and the rabbi wanted to settle the argument that was being asked of him. So he approached, now obviously I'm reminding you that this is all legend that is reported in the Talmud. He approached Mary and promised her that if she would tell him the truth about Jesus' origins, that he would guarantee her eternal life, as if he had the keys to heaven. Okay? Obviously this is all in legend, but this is the legend that is reported in the Talmud. The Talmud comprises both halacha, or law, and haggadah, legend, or stories. What is very interesting, what I want to point out about this legend, is when the rabbi promised eternal life to Mary, he maintained within his own mind and heart a reservation. In other words, he made her a verbal promise and negated that promise in his own mind and heart. So the promise was of no effect in terms of heavenly results. But it got the result for the rabbi that the rabbi wanted. Mary is reported to have responded that on her wedding night, when she was menstruating, the best man came into the wedding chamber and either seduced her or raped her. I don't recall the exact account. But according to the legend, Jesus was both the result of intercourse during menstruation, which is anathema in the Jewish theology, and the result of adultery, intercourse with someone not her husband. The interesting part for me about that legend is the rabbi is praised for lying to Mary, because when he gave her a promise with the mental reservation, that's the equivalent of a lie, and yet for the accomplishment of the so-called divine purpose, he's not only given a free ticket to lie, he is praised for it. Deception is a legitimate part of the practice of Jewish religion or Jewish Judaism, post-exilic Judaism, if it's accomplishing the right purpose. Douglas Reed, in the 20th century, wrote the book The Controversy of Zion, and there's a very interesting article currently available at unz.com entitled Zionism, Crypto-Judaism, and the Biblical Hoax. The point of Guyonneau's article is that this principle of Jewishness, of using deception for the purposes of what is good for the Jews, goes all the way down from Ezra and Nehemiah in 450 BC down to the 21st century. The neoconservatives are all Zionists. The vast majority of them are Jewish, and they basically, let's see, can I come up with the names? Wolfowitz, Pearl, Abrams, and several others basically sold the war in Iraq as an appropriate thing for the United States to do because supposedly Iraq was involved in the attack of 9/11. By a strange coincidence, that same group of neoconservatives advocated the same activity, that is war on Iraq, to Benjamin Netanyahu about 1996, 5 years before 9/11, and it was called a clean break, where they were advocating that Israel change its behavior towards its neighbors and stop trying to be at peace with them, but start actively both gaining territory and gaining political advantage. So the idea of using deception, whether we're talking about American neoconservatives or whether we're talking about Ezra and the rabbi interviewing Mary, the idea of using deception for what is good, if it will accomplish purposes that are good for the Jews, is a long and considered honorable practice. Go ahead, Catherine.
So Christians don't believe that the stories of deception in the Old Testament are okay. They think it's a sin to be deceptive. But you're saying that
the Christians read the Old Testament through Christian glazed eyes or through Christian glazed glasses. They wisely choose to ignore or not consider terribly seriously those elements of the Old Testament that are in clear conflict with Christian principles. For example, contemporary Israelis take the stories of Joshua both literally and as appropriate, where Joshua kills this village and that village and slaughters men, women, children, and oxen and sheep. Christians either pass over that kind of story or say that was appropriate then but not appropriate now. See what I'm saying? We don't look at the ethical implications of the Old Testament, by and large. We being Christians.
Would Jewish people, are you saying Jewish people would teach their children that what Rebecca did was okay?
Absolutely. What Rebecca did was okay. What Esther did was okay. What the rabbi did was okay. And if you can kill your enemy when he's an infant, rather than when he's full grown and a danger to you, kill him as an infant. Now, do all Jews believe that? No. But Jews that hold to, this goes to the definition, or definitions, that Israel Shamir and, oh, forgive me, there's one, Gilad Atzmon. he divides the Jewish community into three categories. The first category is the people who practice the Jewish religion. And Atzmon has no quarrel with those. People practicing the Jewish religion have exactly the same rights and responsibilities as people practicing any other religion. A second category is people who consider their Jewishness as part of their identity. I'm an American, I'm a Jew, I don't want to say Mason, I'm, what other social organization, pardon? Democrat, no, maybe, how about independent? But in any case, it's one of several social identities, okay? The third category with which Atzmon takes great exception is the one who takes his or her Judaism as the essence of their identity, so that their first political, economic, social question is, when they're listening to the news, is it good for the Jews? Right? I think the word Zionism's political influence in the United States, everyone who is honest about it will admit, is enormous, and bespeaks of fooling or buying American support for what is basically good for Israel. Whether it is approximately 40 billion in the next 30 years, the name slips my memory for the moment, or whether it is forbidding Americans to participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement that is led by Palestinians in order to make economics somewhat more difficult for the Jews who are oppressing Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. If the question is it good for the Jews, and that is the determination of whether you are for it or against it, that is part of what Atzmon would consider a sign of not only dual loyalty, but of your Jewishness being the essential part of your being. There's even a Hebrew word for the person who looks at it this way. A Sion, which is singular, or Sionim, which is plural, is the individual who would willingly participate in something that is illicit or illegal if it's to the benefit of the nation state of Israel. Bernard Baruch admitted to a propagandist in Hollywood that he was going to support the Zionist movement. This was in the 1940s. But he said out loud to this individual, "But I'll do it from the tall grass. That's where I'll be most effective." Being in the tall grass is basically doing it in a secret fashion. Justice Louis Brandeis did not do what he was legally responsible to do when he accepted the position of Justice of the Supreme Court. He was supposed to resign all positions of corporate or social responsibility. He remained and acted as the chief officer, if you will, of the Prushim. The Prushim was a secret organization recruiting American Jews to advance the cause of Zionism in the United States. I would submit that both Baruch and Brandeis were acting as Prushim, or acting in a dishonest fashion with respect to their responsibilities as Americans. I just wanted to point that out because that's the first part of what I have to share with you this afternoon. But it is absolutely crucial when the questions come up of dual loyalties. From Atzmon's point of view, if one's Jewishness is the essential part of his being, he is either potentially or actually exercising dual loyalty. And you can't trust, I would just say you can't trust. I wouldn't trust Richard Pearl as far as I could throw him, and I would try to throw him pretty far. Same would apply to any, Wolfowitz, same would apply to Abrams. Any of the neoconservatives who have been in public office in the last 15 years, actually now 18 years, are basically, in my opinion, acting as liars for the benefit of Israel and to the disadvantage of the American people. Questions and comments? Then we'll go on to the other subject matter for the afternoon.
So how is that different than any person of any religion who puts God first in their life, in essence having a dual loyalty? I mean, you can be a Christian and say, yeah, I'm for allowing churches to be on tax-exempt land.
Now, let's ask, that's a good example. Let's ask an interesting question. Should Christians, because they benefit from it, are in favor of churches being tax exempt? Is that, from an ethical point of view, is that an appropriate thing to do?
Well, that's not my question. My question is, how is that not a dual loyalty as well? I mean, in your definition, you're saying dual loyalty is loyalty to being Jewish and loyalty to what? What's the dual part?
Well, in the case of the politics, the dual question is are the interests of the nation-state of Israel more important, or are the interests of the nation-state of the United States more important? And for a lot of Christians, they would say, my Christianity is my expression of my law. In other words, they don't separate. America is peculiar today because Christianity has in large measure stopped existing. It has passed out of existence and is now a question of nationalistic loyalty. We're not as bad as the Nazis, but we by and large don't respect the separation of church and state. We respect the separation of church and state when it's to our advantage, and we applaud the non-separation of church and state, as you just exampled, when it's to our advantage. So in that respect, Christians can be quite hypocritical. The only difference there, I would suggest, is that American Jews are much more organized about it. And in terms of deception, they're much more overt. I'll give you a good example of a person who was exercising his Christian faith. There was a pastor in Europe during the Second World War who was effectively hiding a substantial number of Jews. He got his congregation and multiple congregations in the villages around in France to hide the Jews. And he was very afraid, and on several occasions came close to having to choose between lying and telling a German interrogator the truth about where the Jews were. He had a serious problem with that because his understanding of his Christian faith included the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. That commandment for a scion doesn't exist.
When you talk about dual loyalty, what I'm really hearing you say is
I'm listening.
that you think that the Jewish people,
I'm
that
listening.
there's a portion of people of the Jewish religion who their true loyalty is with being Jewish and with Israel, as opposed to being loyal to the United States. That the Jewish
That's
and
correct.
Israel part trumps the United States.
Yes.
I don't necessarily see that as dual loyalty because maybe they're not particularly, I mean, you're kind of assuming that they're also somewhat loyal to the United States.
The interesting thing is when you claim citizenship, and for better and for worse, citizenship means that you have a single loyalty to that type of entity. That is, you might choose to be a Methodist rather than a Baptist. And so your loyalty in that case would be toward Methodism. When you're talking about nation states, you can only have one, you can only be citizen until 1960. You could only be a citizen of the United States. You couldn't have dual citizenship. With the contest of a Jew who voted in an Israeli election somewhere in the 1960s, the Supreme Court said that voting in a non-American election did not constitute violation of previous law, and therefore they were allowed. Now, there are people who are serving in the Israeli army as American citizens. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. The functionaries of every government have propensities to command at will the liberty and property of their constituents. There is no safe deposit for these but with the people themselves, nor can they be safe with them without information. And informed people control the government. Where the press is free and every man is able to read, everything is safe. Would that it were so today. Dawn and I were chatting earlier, and so you made the comment too, Catherine, about the arrest of Julian Assange. So I want to look at the 8 amendments that are less than well observed by the federal government vis-a-vis United States citizens. Julian Assange was arrested in spite of the First Amendment guaranteeing the freedom of the press. This same charge was rejected by the previous president and has been challenged, and is when the administration is highly motivated, they find a way of punishing the press that they don't like. If the same press that they publishes something that they do like but is equally illegal, they don't punish that. So I don't think you can consider the American press safe unless it prints what our government wants them to print. Now, freedom of assembly. I'm sure you have noticed that if you try to assemble around, let us say, the hotel where the Trilateral Commission is meeting, or the Council on Foreign Relations is meeting, you will be herded into a safe corner where no one can hear you and no one can see you. You are free to assemble in the location that the police squads allow you to assemble. Freedom of speech is, frankly, both in terms of social control as well as what is allowed and not allowed. I have the freedom of speech to be ignored. What I have written, and this is true of a lot of people, if you want the freedom of speech in the Press Citizen, you had better say what the Press Citizen wants you to say. You do not have the freedom of speech if you do not have a vehicle by which to speak. The United States Supreme Court has defined money as speech. Well, you know what? By that definition, I have remarkably little speech, and Bill Gates has a whole lot of speech. That's a ridiculous understanding of freedom of speech. And in terms of freedom to petition for grievances, try it sometime. Everyone in this group is familiar with the assault on the freedom to keep and bear arms, and it is precipitated in no small occasion, by no small number of occasions, by situations where the public is aghast and revolted by the use of military weapon to inflict great harm on great numbers of people. A significant percentage of these are what are called false flags in order to get the public irritated and offended by the use of military weapons. In fact, it is a principle of manipulating the public to create a necessity to change a policy so that we can surrender more of our freedoms. Whether that is the freedom of speech, because we cannot have a riot, or whether it's the freedom to keep and bear arms because some idiot is assaulting someone. There is always a so-called legitimate reason for surrendering an additional portion of our freedom. The protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, how many accounts of SWAT raids have you read in the last month where SWAT teams have delivered warrants, often to the wrong address, often killing an animal or a child in the process of supposedly defending themselves, and serving the warrant for a drug crime or discovering they were at the wrong address. Now, with respect to needing a warrant for such searches, one of the significant ways of changing the public's mind is in our media. As far back as the production of the movie Rear Window, Alfred Hitchcock, you have a public figure saying, if you don't find anything, then you don't need a warrant. Warrants have been ridiculed as unnecessary in the public mind for the last 50 years. They're not unnecessary. The Constitution requires it. As for double jeopardy, quite recently the United States successfully retried a person because when it failed in state court, the same charge was raised against the same individual in federal court, and the individual is convicted on the same charge, same evidence. They simply changed venues.
How do you reconcile all of those inequities with so many people saying, I'm loyal to the Constitution. I believe in the Constitution of the United States. We have the best Constitution in the world.
It is easy to defend the Constitution when you have not had to call upon it for your protection. And if you have had to call upon it for your protection, such as blacks and poor people have attempted to do for the last 70 or more years, it is then that you find out that U.S. citizens are not living under the U.S. Constitution. They are living under statutory law passed by Congress. And in the municipality of the District of Columbia, U.S. citizens answer to the statutory law of Congress, not to the Constitution.
At what level of power do people understand what you just said? That the Constitution is there in name only, and it is not, the people are not protected by the Constitution anymore.
You mean at what level of the power structure is
Yes.
that understood?
Yes.
In a judicial sense, not until you get to the appellate courts. In the representative sense, in the congressional sense, they probably don't understand it until they achieve some kind of position of significance within the Congress. In the representative sense, I can assure you that somebody sits down with someone who has been anointed president and shows them a few films and gives them a few pieces of information that they never had before.
Thank you.
The illusion of a government of laws has been very effectively sold to virtually all of the American people and even to some of the lower people. I don't know, as an example, I don't know whether Tulsi Gabbard understands what her role is and is not, even though she's a veteran of the military services and she's now a representative in the Congress. I don't know if she understands it. I suspect Elizabeth Warren now does, and that is the reason why she is doing certain things that are safe and not doing other things that are unsafe. Just a guess there, though. Trial by jury. It's worth pointing out that there are 2 judicial systems in the United States, actually more than 2. The only place a jury has real power is in a common law court. And in a common law court, a jury's decision is final. Now, how do you get a common law court? In the federal system, the only time you get to a common law court is when you get to the appellate federal courts. And there you can have a jury, but for the most part, the appellate courts are not jury trials. They are magistrate trials. So you have to demand a trial of your peers. You have to know what you are doing in order to begin to make the system work for you. Now, as many people have found out, attorneys do not work for their clients. By the way, the word client, by definition, by legal definition, a client is a person who is mentally incapable of speaking for themselves or defending themselves. Mentally incapable. In other words, you're an idiot. An attorney's loyalty is first to the court, second to the populace, and third to his client. Most of the courts, let me put it this way, in many of the courts, your opponent, if you are a defendant, your opponent is the government, and the judge is an employee of the government. I want that to soak in for a bit. In other words, getting a trial where the court is level is somewhere between very difficult and impossible. I don't think it's impossible because I'm going to spend the next half year educating myself in terms of those issues. With respect to this question of cruel and unusual punishment, you already heard the question debated in the last several years, whether torture or whether waterboarding constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, or for that matter, whether prolonged isolation constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. I have a screenshot to show you, and it's not centered again. Let's see if I can get this just a smidge large for you. Oops, too large. A good article by Johnstone, I don't recall the lady's first name, shows the situation. And in the top picture, you see a description of what we think we are dealing with. The population is looking at a fire as the problem, and the nation as separate from the problem. But what we really have is the nation on fire and the people looking at the fire. Sorry about that. This is Johnstone's summary. The entire United States political system has been deliberately slanted to favor the plutocratic state. That class can only exist in an environment of inequality and oppression. It's a system where money translates directly into power and necessarily creates an environment where those with money rule as kings as long as they keep all the money to themselves. Now, with your permission, I have 2 videos to show you, and I'm going to have to reboot my computer to show you the second, so be aware of that. But this is the shorter one, and I can keep it as it is.
In the old days, kings wore gold on their heads, and when you saw one, you were expected to remove your hat and bow, or you'd be tortured to death in the town square. Then along came the printing press, and people got better at sharing ideas with each other. And pretty soon everyone started to connect the dots and realise that kings were just regular people with gold on their heads. Once everyone started agreeing that they didn't much like being tortured to death in the town square for not grovelling before some schmuck with a shiny hat, kings went out of style. But they didn't go away. As long as there have been humans trying to dominate and control other humans. As societies became larger and more complex, it went from trying to become the alpha human in the tribe, to the alpha human of an entire country, to the alpha human of an empire. But in each case, the impulse to try and dominate as many other humans as possible was the same. When kings went out of style, that impulse didn't leave with them. It simply found a different way of manifesting. The new alpha dominators of the literate world couldn't wear gold on their heads, and they couldn't torture dissidents to death in the town square. The ones who rose to the top were the ones who figured out that they could still function as kings as long as they weren't such egotistical wankers about it. They could no longer sit on thrones and make everyone grovel before them, but with a little bit of cleverness and a whole lot of money, they could have all the power of a king and more. All they had to do was keep the people from realising that they were being ruled. It took them a while to get that last part down, and there were a few false starts, like in France, where everyone started grabbing them and slicing their heads off with French head-slicing contraptions. The new breed of kings which emerged from the chaos and upheaval were ones which understood how to control everyone, but from behind the scenes, without drawing too much attention to themselves. They learned to give the people an official government, to create the illusion of freedom and democracy. And they learned to use their money to dominate every important aspect of that government. They learned how to buy up media, so they could control the stories that people tell themselves about what's going on in their society. Beginning with newspapers, then radio stations, then television, and eventually online media as well. They learn to control the very economic infrastructure which determines how money works. Then they pass their secrets on to their heirs, along with their vast fortunes, in exactly the same way kings used to pass down their crowns. Today's kings rule not with brute force and claims of divine right, but with manipulation and with money. They rule from the shadows, never sticking their heads out into the light for fear they'll start getting chopped off again. They weave happy stories into public consciousness of freedom and democracy, while wielding far more military and economic might with far more control than the kings of old ever dreamed possible. They have used this power to turn humanity into a funnel, which pours ever-increasing amounts of wealth into their treasuries, and thus ever-increasing amounts of power. The earth itself is being stripped bare to quench their insatiable lust for more and more control over more and more humans. But the weakness of the new kings is the same as the kings of old: information. We can share ideas and information and point out what the kings have been doing to us, what they're doing to our planet, and what they're doing to our minds. We can point to their lies, point to their hiding places in the shadows. Because these new kings cannot torture us to death in the town square. All they have is lies and money, and we can see through lies. And collectively, we can change our minds about how money works. When we do that, we can get rid of the new kings just like we got rid of the old kings. Only this time, we can choose to evolve beyond the urge to dominate and control and enslave. And then, our eyes freed from the lies and manipulation and delusion, we can all be kings. And we can heal our planet together. And we can place a crown upon its head. And a new humanity can be born. A humanity that works in collaboration with itself and with its ecosystem. A harmonious humanity. A natural humanity. And that would be truly wonderful.
Sustainable Human sponsored that. The last video is a little longer, and the only way I can play it is by switching programs, so it'll take me a few seconds to do this. I pointed out to Dawn before class started that there are several ways of coping with the tyranny that we now live under. One is to pretend we are free-range chickens and be glad that we are getting fed and deal with the oppression by ignoring it. Another way is to absent yourself from the entire system, to stop being a United States citizen and become a citizen of a state and claiming your position as an inhabitant of the land. That's a long and laborious process, but it's perfectly legal and is being pursued by people who call themselves sovereign persons. The other, I guess, would be revolution, and that is a sure way of raising the wrong kind of leadership and possibly getting seriously hurt.
That's so true.
But I'm more concerned about, I would be in the second line if I thought we could raise responsible revolutionary leadership. But revolutions almost, you look at the French Revolution, you look at the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution was led by intellectuals. And for that reason, although it remained an aristocracy, it had a fairly decent chance of succeeding. We failed as the American people between 1789 and 1860.
I was thinking about that last video in terms of the taxes, because tax season, and you can't even barter with somebody without having to declare it as income. You know, if you're a farmer and you give somebody food in exchange for fixing your cars.
We have no real property rights. Think about that for a moment. that house you live in, that car you drive, that small or not so small acreage of land that has been passed down through your family, or that you have scrimped and saved to acquire, whatever money you manage to keep in your bank account after the government and its cronies have taken their first and second and third cut, none of it is safe from the government's greedy grasp. At no point do you ever have any real ownership in anything other than the clothes on your back. Everything else can be seized by the government under one pretext or another: civil asset forfeiture, unpaid taxes, eminent domain, public interest, etc. The American dream has been reduced to a lease arrangement in which we are granted the privilege of endlessly paying out the nose for assets that are only ours so long as it suits the government's purposes. And when it doesn't suit the government's purposes, watch out. This is not a government that respects the rights of its citizenry or the law. Rather, this is a government that sells its citizens to the highest bidder and speaks to them in the language of force. Under such a fascist regime, the Fifth Amendment to our U.S. Constitution, which declares that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, has become yet another broken shield, incapable of rendering any protection against corporate greed, while allowing the government to justify all manner of takings in the name of the so-called public good. Practically, folks, anything goes now. Ever since the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Kelo versus City of London, the government's limited power to acquire private lands in order to build a public structure like a school or a highway for so-called public use has been expanded. Now the government can make seizures for a public purpose, which in the government's eyes, can mean anything as long as it amounts to higher tax revenue. In Kelo, the city of New London, Connecticut, they wanted to condemn private homes as blighted in order to tear them down and allow a developer to build higher priced homes, a resort hotel, a conference center, and retail complexes to complement a new Pfizer pharmaceutical plant in the area. Ironically, the developers in New London later backed out of the deal after the homes were seized and bulldozed, leaving the once quaint neighborhood a wasteland. Nevertheless, a short-sighted Supreme Court gave city officials the go-ahead, ruling 5-4 that a city government aligned with large corporate interests could use the power of eminent domain to seize an entire neighborhood for development purposes. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor warned, and I'm quoting here, "The specter of condemnation hangs over all property. Nothing is to prevent the state from replacing any Motel 6 with a Ritz-Carlton, any home with a shopping mall, or any farm with a factory." End of quote, folks. Sadly, nothing has prevented the government from bulldozing its way through the Fifth Amendment in an effort to take from the middle and lower classes and fatten the coffers of the corporate elite. In the wake of the Kelo case, at least 16 places of worship, which pay no taxes, were taken for private uses, which will generate tax dollars. Other attempted takings included the transfer of 3 family-owned seafood businesses to a larger private marina in Texas, the transfer of farmland to a shopping center anchored by Lowe's in Illinois, developing 233 low-income and elderly families' properties into senior community where townhouses cost more than $350,000 in New Jersey, and developing middle-income, single-family homes on the waterfront into more expensive condominiums in New Jersey. As an investigative report by the Institute for Justice notes, over the course of 5 years, a mere 5 years, local governments used eminent domain to lay claim to more than 10,000 homes, businesses, churches, and private land for private business development, including condemning a family's home so that the manager of a planned new golf course could live in it, evicting 4 elderly siblings from their home of 60 years for a private industrial park, and removing a woman in her 80s from her home of 55 years, supposedly to expand a sewer plant, only to turn around and give her home to an auto dealership. Fast forward to the present day, and you've got the government's pipeline projects as a prime example of eminent domain being employed for corporate gain money. All across the country, power companies have been given the green light to build massive gas and oil pipelines that crisscrosses the country, cutting through private and public lands as well as unspoiled wilderness. Yet despite often repeated claims by politicians and oil executives about the danger of relying on foreign oil, this U.S. petroleum renaissance never was designed to make America energy self-sufficient. And this was pointed out by journalist Sandy Tolan. She says, a growing amount of that oil will end up in China, Japan, the Netherlands, and even Venezuela. So much for public use, huh? These pipeline projects, which are getting underway in a dozen states, have stirred up a hornet's nest of protests, most notably in Standing Rock, North Dakota, where activists attempting to block the completion of Dakota Access Pipeline were subjected to militarized police, riot and camouflage gear, armored vehicles, mass arrests, pepper spray, tear gas, drones, rubber bullets, water cannons, concussion grenades, arrest of journalists, intimidation tactics, and brute force. Not all the protests that have arisen in response to these pipeline projects hinge on environmental concerns, which are significant in and of themselves in light of water and ground contamination due to leaks and spills. Some of the protesters are landowners, simple farmers and homeowners who merely want the government and its corporate partners in crime to keep their grubby paws off their personal property. Most recently in Virginia, activists have taken to tree sitting, living for weeks on end in platforms suspended above the ground in trees as a form of protest over the devastation that is being wrought by these pipelines. These acts of civil disobedience come at a costly price. Pipeline and forestry officials have worked hard to make life as difficult as possible for these protesters, allegedly blocking their access to food, water, and medical supplies, shining floodlights into the trees at all hours of the night, creating ground disturbances to dislodge their nests, and urging the courts to levy heavy fines for each day that the work to clear the forest for pipeline is delayed. Seriously, it takes a lot of gall to trespass onto someone's private property, tear up their land, cut down their trees, pollute their air and water, prevent them from moving freely on their own property, threaten them with fines and arrests for challenging the intrusion, and then force them to pay by way of taxes to retain ownership of the property or sell it cheaply or at a loss so that it can be torn down and used for some purpose that the government deems more beneficial to its bottom line. But that's what the pipeline company, local police, and federal agents are doing. That's how little respect the government has for our rights. It used to be that you could post a no trespassing sign on your property to send the message that no one could venture onto your private property without your permission. Unfortunately, American taxpayers have become trespassers on their own property thanks to the government's ongoing land grabs and utter disregard for property rights. So much for that whole pipe dream about one's home being one's castle. When it comes right down to it, the right to property is the first and last right and perhaps the most inherent. The undermining and dissolution of this critical right may well prove to be one of the few things to rouse the American people to action, hopefully so. As polls show, Americans have been willing to accept limitations on their rights to free speech, privacy, and due process, as well as other important freedoms in exchange for the phantom promise of security. Yet, whether they live in a modest two-bedroom walk-up in the Bronx or a mansion in Bel Air, Americans have not been quite as willing to barter away their right to their property. In this way, we are not so far removed from the revolutionary spirit that saw a ragtag assortment of colonists standing up to the military might of the Great Britain Empire. The signing of the Declaration of Independence marked a new beginning for our nation. It signaled a shift in the balance of power from one in which the people served an elite ruling class to one in which the government was instituted to serve the people. The government's role would not be to create or define the people's inherent rights, but rather to guarantee their protection. As the Declaration states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration, which embodied all the passion, outrage, and noble ideas of the day, could easily have ended there. But the founders understood that in order for the newly born nation to survive, it would need more than revolutionary sentiment. It would require a government that existed to serve the people, not itself, and a contract to guarantee basic liberties and bind the Union together. Thus was the U.S. Constitution born in the summer of 1787. It sprang forth from the experiences of a revolutionary generation still wary of the strong arm of the government. And from that wariness came our Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to our Constitution are intended as a blueprint to keep the government in its place, off our backs and away from our property. For early Americans, the right to own property was fundamental to all other rights. Now, mind you, the term property is much more fundamental and personal than just with land ownership. It refers to a kind of sovereignty over one's life and possessions, especially one's money. Again, the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." Property is grouped in the same category as life and liberty in the Fifth Amendment because it is difficult to enjoy life and liberty without the stability, security, and assurances that property provides. Private property at a minimum checks governmental power, for it provides the citizen a right of space where even government agents cannot intrude without proper authority. At its core, the American dream is about gaining sovereignty over one's life and property. Without this sovereignty, this unshakable guarantee of ownership and dominion, even over one's own life, there can be no true liberty or freedom. This most sacred of rights is under siege now. More than 200 years after early Americans went to war over their right to life, liberty, and property, we the people have now been reduced to little more than serfs in bondage, indentured servants, and sharecroppers. If the government can tell you what you can and cannot do within the privacy of your home, whether it relates to what you eat, what you smoke, or whom you love, you're not the king or queen in your little castle. If government officials can fine and arrest you for growing vegetables in your front yard, installing solar panels on your roof, and raising chickens in your backyard, you no longer have any property interest in your home. If government agents can invade your home, break down your doors, kill your dog, damage your furnishings, and terrorize your family, your property is no longer private and secure. It belongs to the government. Likewise, if police can forcibly draw your blood, strip search you, and probe you intimately, your body is no longer your own either. This is what a world without true property rights looks like, where the lines between private and public property have been so blurred that private property is reduced to little more than something the government can use to control, manipulate, and harass you to suit its own purposes. And you, the homeowner and citizen, have been reduced to little more than a tenant in bondage to an inflexible landlord. In other words, we're slaves. If you have no choice, no voice, and no real options when it comes to the government's claims on your property and your money, you're not free. You're not free if the government can seize your home and your car, which you've bought and paid for over non-payment of taxes. You're not free if the government agents can freeze and seize your bank accounts and other valuables if they merely suspect wrongdoing. And you're certainly not free if the IRS gets the first cut of your salary to pay for government programs over which you have no say whatsoever. After all, a government that doesn't respect the rights of its citizens will have even less regard for their property, be it land, money, or personhood. So where does this leave us? Battling for our lives, liberties, and our property, folks. Indeed, the battle to protect our private property has become the final constitutional frontier, the last holdout against our freedoms being usurped. Questions about who has ultimate control over our money, how much of it can be claimed by government agents, and how it gets spent goes to the heart of the battle over property rights. Remember, governments generate no wealth at all on their own. Any resources that they have at their disposal have been appropriated from the original producers of that wealth, that's we the people. This fundamental truth has largely been downplayed over the years because the government doesn't want us to remember that it exists to serve at our pleasure and for our common good. Yet any government that ceases to serve this function risks being declared illegitimate. It happened once before. It can happen again. All it takes is the right spark to start a revolution.
John Whitehead runs the Rutherford Institute, and it's one of the best places to learn about what's really happening, because
That's so depressing. Well, I'll have to go drink after this.
I didn't hear you,
I
Catherine.
said
I'm
that's
sorry.
so depressing.
I'm sorry. Well, it is depressing until you decide that you're either going to be a happy free-range chicken, or you're going to be a grouse. And the grouse is free and deals with all of the uncertainties of being a free animal. Somewhere along the line, after I have a whole lot of information, I'll share with you. But the seductive process, the American people have been seduced since 1867 or thereabouts, including 1933 with the Social Security. And in the process of being seduced, they have allowed themselves to become serfs. They started out as sovereigns. In 1860, everyone was a sovereign in his or her own land. By accepting this program, we accepted United States citizenship in the 14th Amendment sense of it, and it's been downhill ever since. It's not an irreversible process, but it's going to take enough people being very angry and organized and intelligent